So climate change is characterized by four characteristics which make it uniquely difficult to solve. The first is just that it is a truly global problem. So there's a massive collective action problem to the extent that you are far over incentivized to pollute because you don't feel the immediate ramifications of your pollution. Rather, the damages that are a result of pollution are just sort of placed around the globe writ large. And also there is a massive first mover disadvantage. So you benefit from the actions that other countries take to deal with their pollution, to clean up the environment, etc. Because again, it is globally, the impacts of climate change are globally spread. But it costs you to deal with your own local emissions, and so you have very strong incentives to just free ride on the actions that other countries take. The second thing is just that it is not felt equally by everyone. That is that in many instances, the countries that are closest to the equator, the countries that are most reliant on crops and agriculture, say that those are their primary export fields. In those instances, you are particularly affected by climate change because the heat waves hit you the worst, and because climate change has such a massive effect on agricultural output and frequently changes the fundamental ways in which we go about harvesting things. Like, for example, it oftentimes changes the optimal time to harvest certain crops. And so the results there are particularly intense, whereas for industries that are much more just you're mining in rock, etc., you're building up industries, that sort of stuff, it is far less of a damage that is posed by climate change directly. And so climate change is not felt equally by everyone. And as a result, there's substantially less pressure on the governments that control the most pollution, the ones that are the most industrialized, the ones that have the largest manufacturing bases, because these are the ones that are frequently the most insulated from climate change. Take, for example, the United States. And this creates a sort of empathy gap where you don't understand the fact that changes in rain patterns are genuinely ruinous for some countries, but don't affect you particularly intensely other than making maybe your summer slightly hotter. The third thing that makes it difficult to address climate change is just that the worst ramifications of our actions are decades away, and the fact is that most political landscapes operate under short-term electoral incentives, and even the ones that don't, where you have one figure in charge for an extended period of time, still have somewhat short-termist in the scope of climate change incentives. And so you don't have very strong incentives to try and deal with a problem that would cost you immensely in the immediate term, but bring benefits, like lots more benefits, 100 to 200 years down the line. And so the incentives just don't line up in a way that is beneficial for climate change. Additionally, many politicians are just older individuals, and so these are the people who are going to face the brunt of climate change the least and probably have the least empathy for it. And this makes creating political will in the first place quite difficult. Fourth, the effects when they happen are somewhat silent. That is, you don't go, well, my summer is slightly hotter, therefore I understand that I need to prevent climate change from occurring. These are small shifts that happen over time that aren't particularly immediately noticeable. Even large weather changes, the increase in the number of storms that hit a given place, are things that aren't necessarily clearly the result of climate change. They could, most people, chalk them up to just things that are happening, natural ways in which the world works. And so frequently you undercredit the result of climate damages. The final thing that makes it uniquely difficult to solve is just that the technology involved in solving for climate change in many instances doesn't even exist in the first place. So while many social movements prioritize and are focused on correcting social injustices, where it is the case that, say, we have these sorts of means to correct for them, it is just not feasible given the way that society is constructed at a given point in time. When it comes to the environmental movement, you frequently have to invest in fundamental research before you are able to actually push for the aims that the movement has writ large. There are three common clashes when it comes to climate change. The first is on radical action. I think the done well versus done poorly clash is particularly important here. A couple of other notes. On the radical side, first, it is worth trying to make the full-scale change tangible, and I think it is also worth trying to weigh on the chance of success. So, for example, even if we only moderately decrease the chance of climate existential threats, it is something that is so intense that the moderate decrease is something that we ought throw away maybe things in the short-term economic benefits, etc. for. Second, if it is particularly radical, and we will return to this later, consider running a defensive principle. So that is, why is it legitimate for climate activists to commit eco-terrorist or explicitly violent acts? I think the way that you can construe this is just the sort of self-defense way that I've talked about previously, just self-defense of future interests and unexpressible interests. So, for example, people who are literally not alive yet or are just being born and cannot politically express themselves. Third, obviously think about what this does to the rest of the movement. So one argument you can make is just that it shifts the Overton window. We've talked about this extensively, but also you can say that it pushes potential voters away. And I think it is frequently worth framing on the side that has radical action how voter change is quite unlikely, because it is very difficult to get people to be single-issue voters and very difficult to get a large enough block of single-issue voters backing the environmental movement that maybe it doesn't matter so much if you push voters away. And instead, the most important thing are maybe the incentives that you create as a result of this. And I kind of already talked about this, but frequently in the more radical debates, you can say that you shift companies' incentives. So it isn't so much that you create public will as a result of this, but literally that companies just don't want to be the ones that have to deal with an explosion on their oil pipe or whatever. And so as a result, companies might preemptively do things like go green in some way. The fourth thing to say, and the final thing to say on the radical versus non-radical clash, is just that I think it is frequently worth shifting the framing of the debate. So, for example, if the motion is this House would criminalize expressions of climate change denial, very obviously this looks like a particularly extreme action you're taking, so it is worth shifting the debate. First, why will norms shift in the long run as a result of criminalization? So you focus on the long run instead of the short-term impacts. So, for example, stigma, companies stop pushing denialist studies because they're afraid of legal backlash. Long-run effect of this sort of narrative is just makes it so that the alternative disappears over time because it just doesn't filter into public discourse or whatever. Second, why is it that we care about the long-term more than the present? This is very easy to weigh on. More people will be alive. It's where most of the impacts actually happen, that sort of thing. Third, why is this such a pressing issue that it legitimizes doing it now? I think one potentially good way of justifying this is just to put the judges in the shoes of someone who has to live 100 years from now and try to explain to them why they might think that this was a justified decision. Second common clash, environmental versus economic trade-offs. I think if you're on the side of the environment, it can be quite tempting to run, they have no chance of saving the climate, therefore they lose the debate. And this is worth running, but not because you fix climate change, but to point out the marginal increase in chance that you do solve for climate change is again worth the economic sacrifices in the short term. Generally, you want to have this debate on three fronts. The first is, what is the immediate effect of the environmental action that you're taking? So maybe people live slightly less smoggy lives in the immediate term because you're taking things into account. You're taking actions that prevent environmental damages that decrease the effect that it has on people in the immediate term. Second, point out how you push the worst harms of climate change back in time, giving you more time to adapt, to invest in and test technologies like geoengineering, and therefore people live slightly longer, slightly less bad lives. And third, point out how you increase the chance that you survive climate change generally and make that something that you weigh on. Given all of those, it is quite difficult for even a well-constructed economic case to actually beat you. I think on the economic side, the best strategic tactic that you can take is just to go through the work of actually explaining why it is maybe that solving for or decreasing emissions and stuff like that is contingent on economic well-being, to the extent that you need a sort of solid economic base before companies are willing to decarbonize, before companies are willing to make risky ventures into electric technology, before companies are willing to do that sort of thing. On the economic side, you should also additionally make the immediate impacts of this very obvious on the economic side as a way of sort of trying to deal with and make it more tangible than the side preferring environmental harms. Third common clash, changes in advocacy or strategy. The first thing that you should do is think about why one of them is more necessary than the other. Two examples of this. Well, one example motion, two examples of it. The example motion is, this House believes that environmental activists should prioritize reforming industrial agriculture over expanding green energy. You could say that tides of investment are turning in favor of green energy. So, for example, there's a constant need for energy expansion, and only renewables can fill this need in the long run, and therefore green energy is getting substantially less expensive. Oh, and additionally, green energy is getting less expensive substantially over time. Therefore, it is not clear why there is a necessity here on the side of the environmental movement. Alternatively, you could say that this is a heavy emphasis of the animal rights group, and it's not clear what additional advocacy is likely to do here. You can also weaponize this on the other side to maybe explain why the animal rights group approach is an approach that is not particularly conducive to people buying in and is worse than the way in which the environmental movement would approach it, and therefore that focusing advocacy here is likely to be particularly effective. Okay, animal welfare. First, it is frequently worth painting out how miserable the plight of animals is, and humanize this. Imagine if you were kept in these conditions. Imagine if every natural inkling in your body was telling you to preen or to migrate, yet you literally don't have the capacity to do so. Imagine how miserable it would be to live a life of confinement and intense pain, such that animals do in cages right now. At this singular point in time, there are more animals confined in farm cages than there are humans who have ever lived on the planet, and their suffering is immense. Chickens, for example, 80 to 90% of chickens live in barren battery cages. Each cage houses around 10 chickens, and each chicken has less than a cubic foot of personal space. High egg demands deprive these birds of calcium, which leads to high rates of osteoporosis, bone breakages, and that sort of thing. Inspection is generally quite difficult because these are cramped conditions, tiers of cages hidden behind each other, and so the birds are frequently left to die horribly painful deaths. Second, broiler chickens. There are 30 million broiler chickens who are alive today, at any given moment. They are constantly bred to grow faster, and currently they reach slaughterhouse size after around 5 weeks of growth, which is far less than chickens that are not genetically engineered in this way. Their legs, however, do not grow as fast because farmers don't care about their legs because it's not what they're being genetically selected for. They're being genetically selected to have the most meat possible. And similarly, their organs get outpaced, which leads to chronic fatigue. The legs not growing fast is quite bad because it means constant physical strainage. Frequently, you cannot move. Frequently, when you do move, you break your legs, and you're constantly in pain because of this. And also, overcrowding is a very major issue. To the extent that the more chickens and we'll talk about this a little bit more in incentives, but the more chickens that you crowd into one small space is the more food that you are able to make at a given point in time. And so as a result, it is very difficult to clean these crowded spaces, which means that bird shit kind of fills the air over time, leading to lots of air pollution and diseases. You live a genuinely miserable life if you are one of these chickens. Farmed fish. Many farmed fish die as a result of oxygen deprivation as a result of overcrowding, and they are not stunned prior to slaughter, meaning that they are fully conscious during their intensely painful death. There are many other horrific conditions that animals go under, but it is worth illustrating some of the most intense ones, and hopefully this gives you good ammo in a debate and makes you think about whether or not you should become a vegan. Second, why are these sorts of conditions structurally incentivized? The first reason is just that animal welfare costs money, and so without direct pressure to not do this sort of thing, there are natural incentives to cause massive harms to animals. The first reason for this is just that companies have an incentive to size max, that is genetically selecting for animals that grow the fastest to butcherable size because it reduces the amount of feed per pound of food that is produced, which lowers the cost for the company. And companies, therefore, have a strong first-mover disadvantage on animal conditions because it gives competitors an advantage over them. Additionally, better veterinary care means higher labor costs, and giving animals more space means less return per square feet, and so you are just incentivized to make conditions effectively as miserable as possible, not particularly because you are a pernicious farmer, but because it is the thing that sells the most money. If you need to ever do some sort of capacity analysis on this, farmers just quickly get desensitized to this, so they deal with animal suffering constantly. Most of them are able to not really think about it and sort of dehumanize. They are animals, the animals that are involved in the suffering. Additionally, farming often occurs at scale because producers seek comparative advantages and cheap food for consumers, which makes cracking down on factory farming politically infeasible because people like their cheap meat and because there is a very intense meat lobby in most places of the world. There can frequently be reasons as to why development of meat replacements is a better idea than trying to curb factory farming. That is, specifically, if you happen to make this a cost-efficient path, then it's something that corrects for itself in the long run and more structurally ingrains itself in the way that we eat food. And there are two sorts of meat replacements. First, to replicate what meat is like via plant-based alternatives. There are some barriers in the way of mass adoption of this. The first is just that people do have a strong aversion to eating plant-based alternatives to meat because it tastes different and has a different texture, because we have an aversion to the artificial, and also just because we have a strong bias for meat for some reason that doesn't seem to be related to any of those other factors. Second, the price of these things is often a little bit more expensive than meat. Plant-based meat tends to cost more. The reason for this is just because it's not really producible at scale yet, and comparatively, conventional meat is produced through and deeply integrated with enormous mature supply chains. So food production has very strong economies of scale. If a company produces millions of pounds of beef, chicken, or pork every week, then paying for fixed costs is considerably cheaper than a smaller plant-based company with a much lower volume. Fixed costs in this instance looking like things like distribution costs, contracts, or machinery costs. And as a result, you kind of have to get your feet on the ground before you are able to actually produce at scale. And this is quite difficult given the sort of natural aversion that people have to eating this sort of food. Second, to avoid taste-based aversions to meat, the processing system behind this form of meat is particularly complex because you want to recreate the distinct chewiness, the flavor, the juiciness, and everything else that is amazing about non-plant-based meats. And as a result, you put lots and lots of costs into trying to actually directly reproduce that. Third, there are just frequently high upfront costs. I already talked about this in sort of the economies of scale thing. And fourth, because of the experimental nature of many of these ventures, you could very well make the argument that it is just more difficult for them to get funding. So, for example, capital markets are afraid of funding an experimental venture for a relatively small market and are much more willing to fund safer ventures into normal, non-created via plant meat. The third major barrier to these sorts of things being adopted is just that people have the habit of buying meat from the grocery store. And people don't think all that much about these sorts of things that they buy. So when you walk into a grocery store and you see plant-based meat you've never seen before, never tried before, etc., even if it is cheaper than the meat that is next to it, you probably just buy the meat that is next to it out of habit. The second way that you can replace meat is just to grow meat from animal cells in a lab. This is obviously much more humane because it doesn't involve sentience, but it also has similar barriers. Arguably, it is more normalizable because it faces less of a taste and texture difference, and also arguably, it is less normalizable because it faces a stronger artificial aversion, and it is very pricey currently. I think it is particularly hard to scale these sorts of things up because a lab-grown meat requires intensely immaculate conditions to be produced in, which, while somewhat achievable in a controlled lab, are particularly difficult to achieve at scale for markets. However, you can argue that these both hold a sort of long-run advantage over farmed meat. And the reason for this is just because farmed meat requires a double burden of food. You have to consume plants in order to feed the animals, which will eventually be consumed, and a simplified picture of the other two processes can make them seem likely to beat out farmed animals in the long run because you don't have to consume plants in order to feed a cow that takes up space and then sell it. You just have to, turn plants into meat or manufacture cow cells in a lab. What are the major barriers that are in the way of animal welfare? The first is just lagging empathy, and frequently there are debates about how to make people more aware and empathetic towards animals, and so these debates just kind of hinge on your ability to characterize, one, of course, the way in which this is going to be done, so is it done well or done poorly, but also the way in which people react to the things that are done by the animal welfare movement. Because one of the stock examples of this is the sort of, we should put images of animal suffering on meat products in grocery stores. And in that debate, you can make the argument that people will just get desensitized. You can make the argument that people will have an aversion to it and therefore go and buy different things or whatever. There are many different ways to make that. But frequently debates hinge on this lagging empathy barrier. A second major barrier in the way of farm animal welfare is just that many industrial farms are, for obvious reasons, private, and so it is quite difficult to expose the conditions on those farms. They want to keep them private, they want to keep them in somewhat desolate areas because very obviously you don't want people to see the mass suffering involved, but also they are just quite loud and noisy places in many instances, so there are natural incentives to do that, and maybe it just makes sense geographically. Third, even when industrial farms are visited, much of the suffering isn't visible. So, for example, with farmed fish, most of the suffering that farmed fish go through happens deep below the surface of the water, where fish are crowded and asphyxiated as a result of just that overcrowding. And the result is that in many instances it just isn't very obvious to see that there is a large amount of harm occurring. And so that kind of shuts empathy out from existing in the first place. And the fourth thing is just that charities for alleviating this sort of oppression barely receive funding, because the funding for animal welfare charities is pretty much zero-sum, and taking an endearing animal out of the pound is just far more morally compelling than the rather silent increases here. Frequently, the sorts of increases you get are ones that maybe decrease the suffering, but in ways that aren't very clearly obvious. It's much more compelling than the rather silent increases you get in this form of charity, especially given the sort of moralized nature of pets. And so that sort of animal charity frequently hogs the majority of funding for animal charities. Okay. There's also a good clash over what it is that animals themselves want. I think there are roughly 3 ways to approach this clash. The first way is to humanize animals, as I kind of did at the start of this section. So place the judges in the shoes of the animals in question, tell them maybe what their inclinations might be, and explain how miserable it is to live that life, how miserable it is to not have access to the things that you want to do with your life, etc. The second thing you can do is to work from revealed preferences, and I think the best justification for this is just that there's a sort of epistemic gap that sits between us and animals, and so we can't really know what their actual preferences ever are. Rather, what we should assume is that their preferences are the ones that are expressed by them via action, and therefore we can infer certain things from that. So, for example, we know that they are pain averse, that they avoid death, etc. Third, you could work from evolution. So there are strong reasons evolutionarily to grow pain sensations, because if you don't grow pain sensations, you're more likely to die off. You're more likely to receive such severe damages to your body that you die very quickly because you're not averse to those damages occurring in the first place. And so evolutionarily, most animals develop some amount of fairly intense pain sensations. You can also frequently point out how animals come from an evolutionary lineage which biologically gave them the drive to do things that they cannot physically do in farms. So, for example, salmon migration, and how confusing and distressing that probably is for those animals. On the other side, while it is difficult to deny animal sentience, you can still weigh humans above them. The first way to do this is to point out that animals plausibly don't have rights. One thing that seems like a precondition for having rights is a clear sense of personal identity. Why? Because each individual is a separate entity with their own will and their own desires, and so it is wrong to treat them as a single aggregate. Many animals do not cross this threshold. So, for example, fish which lack cortexes, while they can probably suffer, seems unlikely that they have a clear sense of their own personal identity, and this seems evolutionarily likely. Complex organisms, actually, we'll return to this section later in animal welfare principles. The second thing you can do is to say that human pain and suffering is worse, and we have higher value caps. I'll return to that second bit later, but on the first, because of our more complex neurological makeup, pain equates to trauma. So while for animals, suffering is frequently momentary, for us it looks like something that frequently affects the rest of our life and has long-term ramifications on us, and therefore the actual impact of it is quite more extensive on some creature that has the sort of complex neurological makeup that we do. This is also a reason to prioritize more complex animals, so for example pigs, as well in debates where you are maybe comparing trade-offs between one animal group and another animal group. Additionally, animals with richer memory, social bonds, fear responses, and pain processing are able to experience more dimensions of harm. That is, all of those are ways in which you experience harm, and so animals that have those sorts of things should be prioritized over others, arguably. And you can, of course, do the opposite. So first, on an obligations-based framework, and again, we'll return to this, so I'm not going to get into it right now, but second, you could say that animal pain and suffering is far worse, because you have no way to rationalize it away. It cannot be part of some greater story, and therefore you are deeply confused by it in the moment. Second, you can weigh on magnitude. So the average human eats 8 to 11 cows in their lifetime. The number of factory-farmed shrimps at any point in time is in the tens of trillions, which is also a reason to prioritize particular animals over others. That is, the larger the animal, the less suffering for one person's meal, and maybe the less we should prioritize them. One additional tip for debates that request advocacy for one animal over another: ask yourself, how much does the animal suffer in the farm? So, for example, egg-laying chickens not raised for their meat tend to suffer far more in farms than chickens who are raised for their meat. One important reason as to why this is the case is just that an injury in a chicken raised for meat damages the quality of the meat that is sold, but something like a bruised wing in a chicken raised for eggs doesn't damage the quality of the eggs at all, so there's less of an incentive to ensure the well-being of chickens raised for eggs. An important question to ask yourself in all of these debates is just, what does the comparative actually look like? So for one, nature is brutal. Animals starve, they freeze, they get hunted, they suffer disease, they break limbs, they lose offspring, they live in constant fear of predators around them. They frequently die horrible, painful deaths, being torn to shreds while somewhat alive in the process. It makes sense for small animals to reproduce in such a way that they have lots and lots of offspring, but don't put much attention into caring for any of the offspring, because evolution finds this very efficient, because with low effort from each parent, you are able to get a high return in terms of offspring. However, in the process, the vast majority of the offspring die short and painful deaths. And so these are sorts of reasons that you can give as to why maybe existence in the wild is not a particularly enjoyable time for animals either. And so it's not totally clear that nature is better in many instances, and you can kind of weaponize the conditions that exist in nature in many debates that don't have comparative analysis prior and just go, one side is particularly bad. This is particularly useful in debates about hunting, so it's not clear that an animal lives a better life if it dies naturally, say from disease, which is quite horrible in many instances, or from a predator, to the extent that that is a horribly painful process. And being shot is something that is quick. It doesn't drag a lot of pain through you. You just kind of die very quickly. And so maybe it is more humane to allow hunting to occur in many instances. The other thing is just that frequently the comparative is non-existent. So for the majority of farmed animals, it's not like they would just live in an alternative world. They're animals that are specifically alive because they satisfy particular wants that we have, and without us using them to satisfy those wants, there would be no reason for them to exist in the first place. And so that then shifts the debate to whether or not a life which is largely suffering, or whatever is characterized to be within the debate, is one that is worth living whatsoever. And I think you can kind of make arguments to both sides here, but it's important to keep a note that frequently you can shift the comparative in that particular strategic way. Another good example of maybe shifting the comparative of a debate is just the debate between farmed fish at the expense of wild-caught fish. So wild-caught fish frequently die horrible deaths being shredded to pieces by sharks or predator animals in the ocean, or wherever they're being caught from. And so you can kind of say that farmed fish, which are creatures that wouldn't exist on the comparative, are just a sort of net negative added to the world. Because not only do you make wild-caught fish live slightly worse lives, because now they aren't just killed quickly via fishing methods, you also make it so that there are an intense number of farmed fish that are living net utilitarian negative lives as well. And so you can shift the comparative in debates like that. That's just an example of it. The other thing to think about is just what new incentives shape animal conditions. So anytime that you impose sort of restrictions on doing harms to animals, how do those shift the incentives of companies, shift the incentives of humans that are involved in the sorts of activities you're talking about, and that sort of thing. And this is something it's something you should think about in most debates, but specifically in these debates, weaponizing the comparative is particularly useful. Okay. Back to the animal rights movement. Just like any movement, the movement for animal welfare and rights is not monolithic. There are a large number of splits in the animal rights or welfare movement, and they tend to fall into one of three categories. That is, splits that fundamentally alter your view of the debate on animal rights, splits with regards to the ends of the movement, and splits on how to get to those ends. A few examples. Split number one. Do animals have rights, or should they just be moral considerations? And by moral considerations, I mean here, maybe it is true that their pain and suffering is bad, but it is not clear that they have, and that pain and suffering being bad should exist in a way up with other things, but it is not clear that they have a specific right to be treated in particular ways. And this is a fundamental split, because it radically changes the way that you view the aims of the movement. So, for example, if you think that animals have rights, you probably are unwilling to justify their use for human benefits, even if that use isn't horribly inhumane. And if you think they are just morally worth considering, then the question changes to how best we can reduce their suffering. Second split, sentience thresholds. Which beings are legitimately aware of their suffering? Also fairly fundamental for very obvious reasons, because really, you prioritize the beings that you think understand the suffering they're going through, because other ones are just less impacted by it. Split number 3, reform versus abolition. This affects the ends of the movement, as you see it. Reformers primarily argue that reducing the suffering of animals trapped in inhumane systems of exploitation and abuse is a good thing. So, for example, you should ban battery cages, you should reduce transport suffering, you should require care checkups, etc. Abolitionists say that this threatens to make exploitation look acceptable by creating human meat. Abolitionists say that this threatens to make the exploitation of animals look like something that is morally acceptable. It means creating humane meat standards or advertising cage-free eggs, which makes consumers feel considerably less guilty when they consume animals, which has the possibility of inadvertently increasing animal suffering by increasing consumption, though I don't think it ends up there at the end of the debate in most debates. I think it is just something that mitigates it marginally. The fourth split is on which animals we ought prioritize, and this has to do with the ends of the movement. So should we prioritize cognitively complex animals? Should we prioritize animals which are focused on the least, where the per dollar return is the most advantageous? Should we focus on animals which receive the most focus because they're the ones where empathy is the strongest and most weaponizable, because they're the ones where there are existing charity-based economies of scale that you can capitalize on and use? Should we focus on the animals which have the largest scale of suffering, so chickens, fish, shrimp, where there are intense numbers that exist at any moment that are undergoing intense pain and suffering? Or should we focus on wild animals? Because wild animals do face intense amounts of suffering, but is it our job to intervene? Do we even have the capacity to intervene in beneficial ways, etc.? Fifth split. This is means-based. How do we convince people? Primarily, the split is between moral shock, so for example, graphic slaughterhouse footage, comparisons to slavery or genocide, and note that those can be particularly alienating, or practical reasoning, so for example, health-based or environmental-based campaigns, human-centered arguments, maybe compassion to some extent, but more practically oriented, etc. So those are all of the primary clashes that come up in animal rights debates. I'll catch you all next week.